Open this gate right now. I am late for my meeting.
The document I found wasn't dramatic to look at. No bold heading, no red stamp screaming importance, just brittle county paper typed in uneven lines with a recording mark in the upper right corner, and enough legal phrasing to make most people's eyes slide right off the page. It was filed as part of a 1961 land transfer tied to the original farm parcel that later became Briar Glen. But buried in the middle of it was a clause so specific, so sharp, that I read it 3 times before I believed it. The subdivision's developer, 2 owners before the current HOA ever existed, had accepted the land subject to a perpetual freight access covenant protecting the branch line and the public crossing connected to it. Not only that, but the language went further. Any successor entity interfering with rail use or petitioning to restrict, abandon, or obstruct that use could be held liable for damages and injunctive relief at the county's request. That alone would have mattered. What made me sit back in the records room was the second paragraph. It named a liquidated damages amount, $200,000. Fixed, automatic upon attempted interference. I remember staring at that number while the clerk's office fluorescent lights hummed overhead and somebody at the front desk arguing about a title search. $200,000 wasn't a theoretical penalty. It was a loaded trap set decades earlier for anyone arrogant enough to think they could erase the line after buying houses near it. Vanessa had built her campaign on a simple assumption that the railroad was a nuisance, the HOA was the community, and the county would eventually side with residents over a freight spur most people barely understood. That document said the exact opposite. The line came first. The crossing came first, and the neighborhood, for all its signs and landscaping and covenant packets, had been built with full notice that the rail corridor was untouchable. I made copies of everything in that file, then requested certified copies the next day. If there's one thing years around railroad compliance teach you, it's that the strongest fact in the world means very little if you can't prove chain, date, and authenticity. At first, I considered going straight to Vanessa. I'm glad I didn't, because by then she had already moved beyond newsletters and noise complaints. While I'd been digging in county archives, she'd been building support inside the HOA itself. The next board meeting made that clear. It was a Thursday evening in the clubhouse conference room, the same room with the fake ficus in the corner and the permanently over-cold air conditioning. Usually these meetings drew maybe 7 people, 10 if the pool had a leak or somebody's fence request got denied. That night, there were 23. Vanessa sat at the center of the folding table arrangement with a binder in front of her, tabs color-coded, a legal pad angled just so. To her right was Craig Lohman, the board treasurer, a man who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. To her left was Denise Hall, vice president, who had mastered the HOA board member expression of polite concern covering total passivity. I signed in and took a seat in the second row. Vanessa noticed me immediately. Her eyes rested on me for half a second longer than necessary. Then she smiled the kind of smile people use when they're already deciding how to describe you later. The agenda moved through landscaping updates, clubhouse key fobs, and a discussion about repainting the pool gate. Then she reached item 7, rail corridor mitigation. That wording was new. She clicked on a projector slide. Up came a neatly formatted presentation titled Community Safety and Sound Reduction Initiative. It included photos of the crossing, screenshots from county GIS maps, and a bullet point list of resident impacts, delayed school traffic, noise intrusion, safety exposure, diminished enjoyment of common property. Again, it looked polished. Again, that was part of the trick. She wasn't presenting law, she was presenting mood with bullet points. Then she unveiled the real objective. The board, she explained, would be considering retention of outside counsel to pursue options related to crossing restriction, corridor review, and possible petition for rail use reassessment. There it was. She still wasn't saying "shut it down" in those exact words. People like Vanessa rarely say the blunt thing if there's a cleaner phrase available. But that was the goal. Hire a lawyer, push the county, force hearings, increase pressure, make the line expensive to defend and politically irritating to keep. I raised my hand. Vanessa ignored it. I raised it again. This time she said, "We'll take comments after the board discussion, Mr. Mercer." Fine, so I listened. Craig asked what outside counsel would cost. Vanessa said preliminary consultation had already been obtained and that a broader engagement package could likely be funded through existing legal reserves. That made my head lift. Existing legal reserves? Briar Glen was not flush with money. We had enough for ordinary maintenance, some savings for long-term repairs, and a reserve account everyone was constantly warned not to touch unless necessary. The idea that she had already explored outside legal consultation without broader notice bothered me immediately. Denise asked whether the county had ever indicated willingness to revisit the crossing. Vanessa said the board was receiving encouraging signals. That phrase stuck with me because it sounded vague in the exact way a person sounds vague when they have nothing concrete. Then she opened the floor. I stood up with my folder in hand. I have a question before the board spends community money on legal action. Has anyone here reviewed the original recorded land instruments for Briar Glen and the predecessor parcel? Vanessa leaned back slightly. I'm sure counsel has reviewed the relevant property history. That's not what I asked. A few people turned in their seats. I pulled out the certified copy and held it up, because I have. That got the room. You could feel attention sharpen. I didn't read the entire covenant aloud. No one would have absorbed it. Instead, I summarized the key language carefully. The perpetual rail access, the prohibition on interference, the county's right to seek injunction, the damages provision. Craig sat forward. Denise frowned. Someone near the back let out a "what?" Vanessa's smile did not disappear, but it changed shape. That document would need legal interpretation, she said. Absolutely, I said, which is why spending community money to challenge the crossing before that interpretation is public seems reckless. She replied quickly, too quickly. No vote has been taken. That was true, but the next thing she said mattered more. We are simply exploring what authority the association may have. That sentence told me she intended to keep going. After the meeting, 3 neighbors approached me in the parking lot. One asked if the damages figure was real. Another wanted to know why this had never come up before. The third, a retired teacher named Marlene Kessler, said, "If she knew about that and kept pushing anyway, she's out of her mind." The problem was, I didn't know if Vanessa knew. Yet. Maybe she had missed it. Maybe the attorney she consulted had missed it. Or maybe she was counting on no one else reading deeply enough to stop her. Over the next 2 weeks, I found out she had moved to the next stage. A community email went out under the subject line, "Protecting Briar Glen's Future." In it, Vanessa described the branch line as functionally obsolete industrial infrastructure and announced that the board was evaluating reasonable legal steps to reduce disturbance and improve safety. She invited residents to a special meeting on funding options. That phrase, funding options, set off all alarm bells I had. I pulled out the HOA declaration and bylaws that night and started reading with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad beside me. Assessments, special assessments, board authority, member vote thresholds, notice requirements, emergency expenditure exceptions. If Vanessa wanted money, the documents would tell me how she planned to get it. By midnight, I found the section. Any special assessment over $12,000 required approval by a majority of all homeowners voting in person or by proxy. Under that amount, the board could approve it directly. The next morning, I called a friend of mine in county administration, not for favors, just for public guidance, and asked whether any petition regarding the crossing had been filed. Nothing had, but he did tell me something useful. Informal pre-filing conversations had occurred with someone representing a neighborhood association. So she was warming up the county. Then came the flyer. It was hand-delivered, heavy cardstock, expensive-looking. Vanessa had spared no effort. Across the top in tasteful dark green font, Special Community Meeting, Strategic Legal Action for Neighborhood Protection. At the bottom, in smaller print, Proposed one-time assessment amount to be discussed. No number. That omission told me she knew exactly how sensitive
The crossing arms were already down. Red lights flashed over the road in sharp bursts, washing the fog in pulses of warning. The horn had sounded once, then twice, then again, long and final, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. Every driver on County Route 18 knew what those signals meant. Stop, wait, let the train pass. Everyone understood that. Everyone except Vanessa Pike. There she stood in a cream-colored rain jacket and oversized sunglasses, one hand on her hip, the other clutching a leather folio like she was about to negotiate a hostile takeover instead of standing in front of an active railroad crossing in rural Kentucky. Behind her, a line of idling cars had started to form, pickup trucks, a school aide in a compact sedan, a landscaper's trailer, people on their way to work, to the store, to a normal Tuesday. And there was Vanessa, president of the Briar Glen Homeowners Association, acting like the rails belonged to her. I could see her from half a mile out. When you've worked freight long enough, you learn to read trouble at a distance. A tarp fluttering too close to the line, a truck angled wrong at a service road, a person standing where people should not stand. Trouble has a shape before it has details. That morning, Trouble was standing upright in expensive boots. My name is Eli Mercer. I've spent 23 years on the railroad and the last 8 as an engineer for Cumberland Valley Freight. Most mornings begin the same way for me. Black coffee in a steel travel mug, switch list folded into my jacket pocket, diesel in the lungs before sunrise. There's comfort in routine. Steel, schedules, signals, machines are honest. They do what they're built to do. Neighborhood politics are not honest. And that, more than anything, is how I ended up here. Because what happened at that crossing didn't begin that morning. It began years earlier in a neighborhood called Briar Glen, with neat stone entry signs, tidy mailboxes, and the kind of HOA newsletter that always used the phrase community standards like it was holy scripture. When my wife Dana and I moved there with our son and daughter, it seemed manageable. Not luxurious, not fancy, just stable. 240 homes tucked against a low ridge outside Belmere, Kentucky. There was a retention pond with geese no one liked, a walking trail with splintering benches, and a narrow county road that crossed an old freight branch line at the east edge of the subdivision. That line had been there long before the first house, long before the clubhouse, long before Briar Glen had entrance landscaping and a board president with a spreadsheet. The crossing itself was public, county maintained, recorded access, legal, active, and boring in the way infrastructure is supposed to be boring. Once or twice a week, a freight run came through carrying lumber, feed, and industrial supplies to a distribution spur further south. Slow-moving, predictable, and over in less than a minute. That should have been the end of it. But people like Vanessa Pike cannot leave ordinary things alone if those ordinary things refuse to answer to them. Vanessa moved into Briar Glen about 5 years after we did. Within a year, she was on the Briar Glen HOA board. Within 2, she was president. She had a polished voice, perfect posture, and a talent for making unfairness sound administrative. She never seemed emotional. That was part of what made her effective. She could issue a warning letter about children's chalk drawings with the tone of a pharmacist explaining dosage instructions. At first, I thought she was just strict. Then I started noticing patterns. The first family she targeted hard was the Carters, one of the few black families on our side of the subdivision. Their teenage boys had one of those portable basketball hoops at the edge of their driveway. Vanessa cited them for recreational equipment visible from the street. A month later, her friend Melissa down on Juniper Court put a rusted practice soccer goal in her front yard for nearly the whole summer. No letter, no fine, no problem. Then came the Alvarez family. Their mailbox post was architecturally inconsistent. She fined them. 2 streets over, a board member had painted her shutters completely different shade than the approved palette. Nothing happened. Once you see selective enforcement, you can't unsee it. My own turn came over something so small it would have been funny if it hadn't cost me weeks of aggravation. I built a cedar planter box along the back fence of our yard. It sat well inside our surveyed property line. I had the plat map to prove it. Vanessa sent a violation letter claiming I had placed a structure on HOA common space. I emailed the survey. She responded 3 days later, saying that regardless of lot boundaries, the planter interfered with the visual continuity of the adjacent greenbelt. That was my first lesson with Vanessa. If one reason failed, she would simply invent a new one. So I started documenting. Not dramatically, not obsessively at first. I kept copies of notices, saved emails, printed the bylaws, marked sections with tabs, wrote dates in the margins. If you've ever worked around equipment logs and inspection records, paperwork becomes second nature. You don't keep records because you expect war. You keep them because memory is soft and paper is hard. Over time, the folder got thicker. Then Vanessa discovered the railroad. Her campaign started with noise complaints. She claimed the train horn was excessive. She said children were being startled awake. She said property values were at risk. She used phrases like quality of life erosion and residential peace corridor. Phrases so polished they sounded pre-written. She began circulating petitions, then newsletters, then email blasts warning residents that Briar Glen was being held hostage by legacy industrial use. That phrase made me laugh the first time I read it. Then it stopped being funny. Because the train she was demonizing was sometimes mine. She either knew that or quickly learned it, and once she did, I stopped being Eli from Lot 47 and became, in her version of the story, the man bringing nuisance and danger into the neighborhood before breakfast. Neighbors who'd waved for years began offering stiff nods instead. A few avoided eye contact entirely. Narratives work that way when repeated enough times. You don't have to prove anything, you just have to say it enough times that people get tired of doubting it. Vanessa's next move was more strategic. She pushed the board to designate the strip of HOA green space near the crossing as a quiet recreation area. It sounded harmless. Benches, wildflowers, maybe a picnic table one day. But the language she inserted into the resolution framed rail noise as an intrusion on a community amenity. That mattered. Not legally, maybe, but politically, absolutely. She wasn't trying to beat the railroad in court yet. She was preparing the neighborhood to believe it should be beaten. So I did what she did not expect me to do. I went looking backward. County clerk's office, old plats, right-of-way filings, easement maps, annexation documents, probate chain references, dusty records rooms full of boxes with labels half faded from age. I spent lunch breaks and Saturdays reading paper older than I was. And one afternoon, in a file tied with cotton tape, I found a document that changed everything. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not my wife, not the neighbors, not even the railroad's legal department. I copied it, put it in a manila folder, and drove home with my hands tight on the wheel. Because if I was reading it correctly, Vanessa Pike wasn't just making noise. She was walking the HOA straight toward a financial cliff. And she had no idea. By the time that Tuesday morning arrived, by the time I saw her standing at that crossing with her folio and her crossed arms, the story had already been moving toward collision for months. But she still thought she was the one in control. She only realized she wasn't when the locomotive stopped, the cab door opened, and I climbed down. And what I said to her next is what changed Briar Glen for good. I'll show you the document I found in county records, the hidden clause Vanessa never saw coming, and the HOA vote where her whole plan nearly blew up in front of the neighborhood.
The special meeting was scheduled for a Monday night at 7 p.m. in the Briar Glen clubhouse. By 6:40, the parking lot was full. That alone told me Vanessa had played this well. Most HOA meetings die in apathy. People complain in kitchens, group texts, and driveways, but when it's time to sit in metal chairs under fluorescent lights and listen to procedural nonsense, they suddenly remember errands. Vanessa understood that, so she packaged the issue emotionally, not as rail law, not as county infrastructure, as family safety, peace, and protecting property values. Those three phrases can get a crowd almost anywhere. When I walked in, someone had set up rows of chairs facing a projector screen. At the front sat the board, each with name placards like this was a corporate hearing instead of a suburban governance meeting. Vanessa had dressed carefully. Navy blazer, pearl earrings, hair pinned back. She looked less like an HOA president than someone preparing to testify on cable news. On the screen behind her, Briar Glen's Strategic Response Plan. I took a seat on the aisle. Dana had wanted to come, but one of our kids had a school project meltdown, and honestly, I was glad she was home. HOA politics have a way of turning decent people into spectators at a knife fight. I didn't want her in the middle of that room if things went sideways. Vanessa opened by summarizing the ongoing issue of freight traffic through the crossing. She repeated her now familiar points: noise, disruption, child safety, emergency access, and long-term neighborhood desirability. Then she introduced a local attorney seated near the front, Martin Sloan, who gave a cautious little speech about exploring legal remedies available to residential communities impacted by legacy commercial corridors. Again, careful language. Nothing direct. Nothing you could pin down cleanly later. Then Vanessa got to the number. The board, she said, was proposing a one-time legal assessment of $11,900. I nearly smiled. There it was. $12,000 required a community vote. $11,900 did not. She had brought it in one breath below the threshold. That wasn't an estimate, it was a target. A few residents murmured but didn't react strongly. To many people, $11,900 sounds like a board-level number, not a personal one. They don't immediately divide it across homes. They hear it as institutional money. Vanessa knew that too. She clicked to the next slide, where the amount was broken into categories: legal review, filing preparation, administrative support, communication strategy. It all looked maddeningly professional. Then she called for board discussion. Craig Lohman cleared his throat and asked whether the full amount would come from reserves or require direct billing to residents. Vanessa answered smoothly that the board intended to use reserve funds temporarily, with replenishment mechanisms to be considered later. Reserve funds. There it was again. This time my stomach tightened. Reserve funds are supposed to be the neighborhood's safety net. Roofs, drainage, pavement, fencing, structural repairs, boring but essential things. If Vanessa was treating reserves like a war chest for a pet legal crusade, the crossing was only one front in a much bigger problem. I raised my hand. This time, before she could ignore me, Marlene Kessler from the third row said, "I think residents should be allowed to speak before money is committed." That helped. So did the 20-some people in the room. Vanessa gave a brittle nod. 3-minute comments. I stood with my folder. First, I addressed the covenant document. I summarized it plainly, with no theatrics. Public crossing, protected freight access, damages exposure for attempted interference, county enforcement rights. I held up the certified copy and offered to let any resident review it after the meeting. Then I shifted to the bylaws. Second, I said, the declaration allows the board to approve assessments under $12,000 without membership vote. This proposal comes in at $11,900. Residents should understand that number is not arbitrary. You could feel the room wake up. Vanessa interrupted. That is a misleading characterization. It's a mathematical one, I said. A few people laughed. Not many, but enough. Then I made what I thought was my strongest point. Using reserve funds for speculative litigation over a county-protected crossing could expose the board to fiduciary challenges if the action lacked clear community benefit. That landed harder than I expected. Not because everyone understood fiduciary duty in a legal sense, but because they understood this much. If the board misused neighborhood money, homeowners could pay for it later. Martin Sloan, the attorney, stepped in to cool things down. He said the board was merely authorizing preliminary legal action, not a final petition. He said reserve usage was permitted for association protective expenditures. He said no decision had yet been made on formal county filings. All carefully chosen phrases. What struck me was what he did not say. He did not dispute the covenant. He did not say the board had no risk. He did not claim the damages clause was invalid. He just tried to narrow the room's focus. The board moved to vote anyway. Craig hesitated. Denise looked uncertain. A board member named Laura Pence, who rarely spoke in meetings, quietly asked if the legal budget had already incurred charges. Vanessa answered too quickly again. Only minimal consultation. That phrase lodged in my mind. Minimal, according to whom? The vote passed 3-2. Craig voted yes, but reluctantly. Denise voted yes. Laura voted no. Another board member abstained. Vanessa, of course, voted yes. Just like that, the board had authorized $11,900 in legal spending and reserve use. Residents filed out in a buzz of low conversation. A few stopped to ask me questions. One man asked whether he could get a copy of the covenant. Another wondered if reserve money could be tracked. Marlene Kessler told me, if she's already spending, she's hiding it in plain sight. That phrase stayed with me, because the next morning I decided to stop speculating and start pulling records. Under the governing documents, homeowners had a limited right to inspect certain association records, budgets, annual summaries, meeting minutes, and, if requested correctly, some financial statements. The right was narrower than it should have been, but it existed, so I filed a written records request. Vanessa responded 2 days later with the kind of email that sounds cooperative while delivering very little. I would be permitted to inspect the annual budget summary, year-end balance sheet, and board-approved minutes by appointment at the management office. That was not enough, but it was enough to start. The management office wasn't some big independent firm. Briar Glen used a tiny contract administrator who worked out of a 2-room suite above a tax preparation office near the highway. When I arrived, a part-time office assistant handed me a stack of papers and a sign-in sheet and left me alone at a laminate table with a dying ficus plant in the corner. The annual budget summary showed ordinary categories: landscaping, pool maintenance, utilities, insurance, legal and administrative, reserve contributions. Nothing explosive at first glance. But then I compared the year-end balance sheet to the prior annual mailing I had saved from the year before. The reserve account had dropped far more than the listed capital expenses could explain. Not a little, a lot. I wrote the numbers down and checked them twice. Even allowing for drainage work done the previous spring, there was still a gap of over $40,000. $40,000. I asked the office assistant whether there was a general ledger available for owner inspection. She said she wasn't sure. I waited. Eventually, the contract administrator came out, glanced at my request, and said detailed ledgers were not typically provided without board approval. I asked where in the governing documents that restriction appeared. He didn't answer directly. That told me he was following instruction, not policy. I left with copies of the summaries and enough concern to justify the next step. I called an attorney. Not the railroad's lawyer, someone local who handled nonprofit governance and property disputes. Her name was Nora Bell, and she had the brisk, unromantic way of speaking that I've learned to trust. I explained the crossing issue, the covenant, the special assessment, and the reserve discrepancy. She asked one question before anything else. Do you think this is incompetence or concealment? I said, I think it started as control and may have become both. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, get me minutes approving legal expenditures and anything showing vendor names. That part mattered. Vendor names. Because money leaves footprints even when summaries blur them. Over the next week, I requested board minutes from the past 18 months and began combing through them at night after dinner. Most were dry and vaguely written, the way HOA minutes often are when boards want to record outcomes without preserving too much context. But I found repeated references to administrative consulting support and special compliance management services. No company names, no detail, just enough wording to justify checks later. Then I got lucky, or maybe Vanessa got careless. Laura Pence, the board member who had voted no, knocked on my door one evening just after sunset. She looked nervous enough to turn around any second. In her hand was a plain white envelope. She said, "You didn't get this from me." Inside were 3 photocopied pages from a supplemental expense register. There were line items under legal. The next morning, I sat in Nora Bell's office with a cardboard folder on my lap and a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, the sense that the ground had shifted. Not in Vanessa's favor, in mine. Nora's office was on the second floor of a brick building above a dentist and across from the county library. It smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. She wore reading glasses low on her nose and had the habit of tapping one finger against the desk whenever she was concentrating. She read quietly for nearly 20 minutes. First the covenant, then the reserve summaries, then the photocopied expense register Laura had slipped me. Then the Secretary of State printout showing Blue Summit Community Advisors LLC and the listed organizer, Melanie Pike. When she finally looked up, her expression hadn't changed, but her voice had. "Okay," she said, "this is no longer just an HOA overstepping its lane." I asked what she thought we had. She answered in plain terms. Potential self-dealing, possible breach of fiduciary duty, improper use of reserve funds, and if the board had authorized or concealed payments without proper disclosure, a basis for legal action brought by a homeowner on behalf of the association itself. That last part was the one that mattered most, a derivative action. The idea is simple, even if the legal paperwork isn't. When the people controlling an organization won't protect it from their own misconduct, someone with standing can ask the court to step in for the organization's benefit. In other words, if Vanessa had used Briar Glen's money to enrich a company tied to her family while pushing a personal campaign against the rail line, the HOA did not merely have a problem, the HOA itself was potentially the victim. Nora leaned back and asked me a question I still remember exactly. "Do you want to stop the crossing fight," she said, "or do you want to end the machinery that made it possible?" I said, "Both." She gave a short nod like that was the right answer. Then she laid out the strategy. First, we would send a preservation letter demanding retention of financial records, vendor contracts, board communications related to Blue Summit, and any legal invoices connected to the rail campaign. Preservation letters don't prove wrongdoing, but they make it much harder for someone to later claim records were lost accidentally. Second, we would prepare a formal demand to the board, suspend any further rail-related legal expenditure, disclose all reserve-funded contracts, and investigate the Blue Summit payments. Third, if the board refused or stalled, Nora would file a derivative action seeking accounting, disgorgement, and injunctive relief. The word injunctive mattered almost as much as the lawsuit itself. If we moved fast enough, we could ask the court to block further spending and possibly stop Vanessa from taking any formal county action on the crossing until the financial mess was examined. Defense was over. Now we were building pressure. Before I left, Nora said one more thing. Don't announce all of this yet. That surprised me. She explained why. People like this survive by managing information. If she knows exactly what you have, she'll shift the story before the documents can speak. So we stayed quiet. Outwardly, anyway. Behind the scenes, the pressure began almost immediately. Nora's preservation letter went out that afternoon by certified mail and email. It named the categories of records with enough specificity to put everyone on notice. It also referenced Kentucky nonprofit governance obligations and conflict of interest rules in language that was impossible to misunderstand. Vanessa responded the next day through attorney Martin Sloan. His reply was polished, short, and irritated. He denied any wrongdoing, described Blue Summit as a legitimate vendor providing community advisory services, and accused me of attempting to personalize a policy disagreement over rail-adjacent land use. That phrase was so lawyerly, it almost made me admire it. Almost. But again, he didn't deny the family connection. He didn't claim the reserve transfers were false. He didn't offer invoices or contracts. He just tried to reduce the entire thing to a disagreement. That told Nora everything she needed to know. They're buying time, she said. Meanwhile, Vanessa made her next move. She called another board meeting. Not the usual monthly one, a special action meeting, 3 nights later. The notice said the board would consider final authorization of county petition preparation and related legal directives, which, translated into ordinary English, meant she wanted to lock in the rail strategy before the financial questions could spread through the neighborhood. That was classic Vanessa. When threatened, accelerate, force the vote, create momentum, make everyone else react to a decision already made. But by then, she wasn't the only one talking to board members. Laura Pence was quietly done with her. Craig Lohman, according to his wife, had become deeply uneasy after Nora's preservation letter arrived and started asking for backup documentation Vanessa had never previously been required to produce. Denise Hall was still drifting whichever way authority blew, but authority no longer felt as solid as it had a week earlier. And the neighborhood was changing. My inbox started filling. Some messages were supportive, some cautious, a few openly angry, mostly from residents who still believed the train was the issue and thought I was endangering community unity. But the tone had shifted from passive acceptance to questions, real questions. About reserves, about contracts, about whether any board vote ever disclosed ties to Blue Summit. Once people start asking financial questions, fear changes sides. I spent the afternoon before the meeting printing organized packets, covenant excerpts, reserve comparisons, Secretary of State records, and a 1-page timeline of board actions tied to rail spending. Not to hand out indiscriminately, just to have. Facts are most useful when they're arranged before you need them. Dana watched me doing all this at the kitchen table and said, "You know she's going to try to make this about you." I said, "She already has." She said, "No, I mean personally." She was right, and that's exactly what happened. The meeting started at 7. By 6:45, the clubhouse was packed beyond anything I'd seen there before. Not just curious residents, agitated ones, people whispering in clumps, looking at printed emails on their phones, comparing fragments of information they'd picked up over the last week. Vanessa entered carrying 2 binders and wearing the expression of a woman determined not to acknowledge that control was leaking out of the room. Martin Sloan was there too. That was new. So was a local freelance reporter I recognized from county planning meetings. Apparently somebody had tipped off the paper that Briar Glen's board fight had turned into a financial dispute. Small-town reporters have a sixth sense for that kind of thing. Vanessa opened briskly, skipped all non-essential items, and moved straight to the rail authorization agenda. Her plan, stated calmly, was to approve final legal preparation for a county petition challenging the crossing and associated rail activity impacts. Before she could call discussion, Craig spoke. "I want the Blue Summit contract produced first." You could feel the room tighten. Vanessa didn't look at him immediately. She shuffled a page, then said, "That matter is separate." Craig said, louder this time, "Not if reserve money paid for it." A murmur rolled through the chairs. Then Laura spoke too. "I'd also like to know whether any board member disclosed a familial relationship to that vendor." Denise turned toward Vanessa so fast it was almost comical. It was the first sign she may not have actually known. Vanessa lifted her chin and said, "Blue Summit has provided strategic administrative support to this community for a year. Any insinuation of impropriety is defamatory." That was the wrong word to use in a room full of people who were no longer in the mood to be managed. I stood and asked to speak. Martin Sloan started to object, but Nora Bell, who had quietly arrived 10 minutes earlier and taken a seat near the back, stood too and said, "My client is entitled to address the financial implications of a proposed action involving association funds." Hearing a lawyer say "my client" in that room changed the temperature instantly. Vanessa saw her then, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked surprised. I kept my remarks short. I summarized the covenant damages. I stated that legal counsel had been retained regarding possible self-dealing and fiduciary breach tied to Blue Summit. I noted that a preservation demand was already on record, and I added one final point slowly enough for everyone to hear it. If this board votes tonight to continue spending reserve funds on the rail petition without disclosing related vendor relationships and legal exposure, that vote—
By the time I set my alarm that night, the whole thing had moved beyond HOA politics. It was now county business, railroad business, potential court business, and because somebody in Belmere always knows somebody at the paper, public business too. I slept badly, not from fear exactly, more from that wired, hollow feeling that shows up when a conflict has gone on too long and is finally narrowing toward a single point. 11 months of Vanessa's train campaign, years of selective fines, petty enforcement, and manipulative board maneuvering, weeks of digging through records and comparing numbers at my kitchen table. The pressure had built in layers. Now it was all converging on one morning. At 4:20 a.m., I was in the yard office signing on to the locomotive. Diesel in the air, fluorescent glare on the concrete, cold coffee in my travel mug because I'd poured it too early and forgotten to drink it. The consist for that run wasn't huge. Feed cars, treated lumber, hardware freight for a spur customer south of Belmere, but it was enough to sound and feel larger than it looked. Freight always does at a crossing. I ran through the normal checks with more attention than usual, not less. Anyone who thinks a tense morning is when you cut corners has never worked around steel and momentum. Procedure becomes the anchor. Gauges, brake test, radio, documentation, ordinary things done correctly. At 5:05, I got a call from dispatch, then one from operations, then a short message from Nora. County aware. Don't improvise. Stick to protocol.
That had always been the plan. Because here's the important thing. What happened next only worked because it was legitimate. Cumberland Valley Freight had authority to order a crossing stop for operational inspection where warranted by reported concerns, obstruction questions, or crossing condition review. Given the recent complaints, the board drama, and the attempted county petition activity, there was more than enough basis to conduct a documented inspection at Briar Glen that morning. No theatrics, no stunt, just procedure, carried out in full view of people who had spent months pretending procedure was on their side. A little after 6, my conductor, Wes Harlan, climbed into the cab, looked at me, and said, "You ready for whatever nonsense this is?" I said, "As ready as I'm going to get." He grinned. "Paper says someone called in saying there'll be a crowd." That didn't surprise me. After the failed board meeting, Vanessa had sent a late-night community email. I didn't see it until after midnight, but by then, screenshots were already circulating. The subject line read, "Emergency Neighborhood Presence Requested." In it, she claimed the HOA was under coordinated attack by outside interests and one resident acting against community welfare. She urged supporters to gather peacefully at the crossing before the train's scheduled pass-through to show county officials that Briar Glen will not be ignored. That was classic Vanessa. Dress panic up as solidarity. What she probably imagined was a sympathetic cluster of residents, a few dramatic photos, maybe some footage she could use later to revive the narrative that she was bravely defending the neighborhood from intrusion. What she failed to anticipate was that other people were now paying attention too, including the county, and the paper, and residents who had finally started asking what exactly she had done with their money. We approached Briar Glen just after 7 a.m. Fog sat low over the drainage ditch beyond the east shoulder, and the trees along County Route 18 were just beginning to tip into autumn. The warning lights at the crossing were visible from a distance, blinking through gray air. Then, as the line curved, the scene ahead came fully into view. There was a crowd. Not huge, maybe 20 people, some with coats thrown over pajamas, some in work clothes holding travel mugs, a couple standing with arms folded in that half-committed posture people adopt when they're not sure whether they're attending a protest or an awkward neighborhood misunderstanding. There were also 2 county vehicles parked off to the side, and a photographer, and Vanessa. Of course Vanessa. She stood near the lowered gate in a camel-colored coat with a printed folder under her arm. Even from the cab, I could tell she had arranged herself for visibility. Not in the track path, she was smarter than that, but near enough to claim symbolic possession of the crossing. Wes looked out the side window and let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, "she really committed." The crossing horn sequence sounded. Long, long, short, long. The gate stayed down. Cars waited. The crowd shifted. And I brought the locomotive to a controlled stop exactly as planned, with the lead unit positioned at the crossing for inspection. If you've never been close to a freight locomotive coming to rest, it's hard to explain the sensation. The whole machine settles with a deep mechanical exhale. Metal groans. Air releases. Heat and diesel roll forward into the cold morning. Then, after all that force, there's a strange stillness. Not silence, the engine still idles, alive under you, but stillness of motion, controlled mass at a standstill. I put on my hard hat, took my inspection tablet, and climbed down. The air hit cold and damp. Gravel crunched under my boots. Every eye at that crossing turned toward me. There are moments when a room goes quiet around you. This was stranger than that, because it wasn't a room and it wasn't truly quiet. The engine throbbed behind me. A dog barked from somewhere in the subdivision. One of the crossing bells still clanged, but socially, humanly, everything narrowed. Vanessa recognized me halfway through my descent. You could see the exact instant. She had known, abstractly, that I worked the line. She had used that fact politically for months, but abstract things feel different when they step out of the cab and start walking toward you in a safety vest. I did not hurry. I walked first to the crossing assembly and began the inspection exactly as trained. Gate arm, signal housing, control box exterior, visual sweep for obstruction, debris, tampering. I logged the stop and noted observed conditions. One of the county officers, Deputy Code Inspector Raymond Cole, though I didn't know his full title until later, was already standing near the roadside shoulder holding a plastic evidence bag. In it was a weatherproof sign that had been zip-tied to the gate arm before dawn. That was another thing Vanessa had done overnight. The sign read, "Briar Glen Residents Demand Crossing Review." At the bottom was a QR code linked to a petition page. County-maintained crossing equipment, it turns out, is not a bulletin board. Inspector Cole had removed it before we arrived and was now preparing a citation. Vanessa watched all this with a face trying very hard not to register alarm. When I finished the mechanical check, I turned to the group and said, at normal speaking volume, "Morning." No one answered immediately. The photographer got several shots right then. I know because I saw the camera burst. Vanessa was the first to speak. "You cannot hold this crossing. You're disrupting residents to make a point." Her voice carried well. She was performing for the crowd and for the article she hoped still might favor her. I answered the way Nora had told me to. Factual, calm, documented. This stop is a recorded operational inspection under company authority. It is lawful, logged, and related to reported crossing concerns. Then I paused and added, which, as I understand it, have been numerous. A few people in the crowd made small sounds, half laugh, half surprise. Vanessa took a step forward. "This neighborhood has an active safety grievance against this line." Inspector Cole cut in before I had to. "This neighborhood," he said evenly, "does not supersede county right-of-way." Then he handed her the citation for the sign. That changed the crowd more than anything I said. Authority matters to people. Not moral authority, official authority. A county form in a county envelope handed over in public has a way of puncturing performance. A woman near the back, I later realized it was Marlene Kessler, said, "Is that for her?" No one answered, but no one needed to. At that point, the reporter stepped closer. She introduced herself from the Belmere Ledger and asked if I would confirm whether the crossing was protected by recorded land instruments. I said yes. I gave the clean version. The crossing predated the subdivision. The rail corridor was protected by recorded covenant. Any attempt by successor interests to interfere with that use could trigger county enforcement and financial liability. I did not mention every legal detail. You don't litigate into a reporter's phone, but I said enough. Then the reporter turned to Vanessa and asked whether she had disclosed that risk to residents before seeking legal spending. Her answer was a masterpiece of evasiveness. She said the board had been evaluating a range of options and that some parties were trying to silence legitimate residents' concerns through intimidation. Again, wrong move, because this time the crowd didn't automatically follow her. Several people looked away. One man who had clearly come as a supporter asked, "Wait, what financial risk?" Another said, "How much did we spend?" By the next afternoon, Vanessa Pike was no longer just an overreaching HOA president with a train obsession. She was a named problem. Nora filed the derivative action in County Circuit Court just after lunch. The complaint was narrow where it needed to be and ruthless where it mattered. It alleged breach of fiduciary duty, failure to disclose conflicts, misuse of association funds, and improper payments to Blue Summit Community Advisors, the company linked through state records to Vanessa's sister, Melanie Pike. The filing sought a full accounting, return of improperly spent funds, injunctive relief against further unauthorized expenditures, and, if the evidence supported it, Vanessa's removal from any board role involving financial authority. The complaint did not include every rumor floating through the neighborhood. That's one of the first lessons a good attorney imposes on a messy situation. Leave the gossip out. Use documents, use dates, use signatures, transfers, resolutions, and omissions. Judges do not care about who rolled their eyes at whom in the clubhouse. They care about records, and the records, by then, were beginning to tell a very clear story. Once the lawsuit was filed, discovery pressure changed everything. Things that had been confidential board materials a week earlier suddenly had to be preserved, produced, or explained. The board's insurer got involved. Martin Sloan's tone shifted from dismissive to defensive. Craig and Laura both retained separate counsel for advice, which told me they were no longer confident Vanessa could shield them by claiming all decisions had been routine. Within days, more of the paper trail surfaced. Blue Summit had not merely provided vague, community advisory services. Its invoices, when finally produced, were laughably thin. Generic line items, strategic compliance review, community transition planning, enforcement support optimization, the kind of wording people use when they want a payment to look technical without inviting questions. There was almost no measurable work attached, no substantial reports, no deliverables that justified the amount, no clear board minutes showing informed approval after conflict disclosure. And the numbers were worse than I first thought. It wasn't just 13 monthly payments. There had also been 2 lump sum transfers coded as special administrative support, pushing the total to just over $54,000. $54,000. Money drawn directly or indirectly from the financial cushion every Briar Glen homeowner thought was being protected for roads, drainage, fencing, and repairs. Vanessa had built an image around order and discipline. She cited flower pots, porch decor, temporary hoops, mailbox paint, and planter boxes as if she were guarding civilization itself. Meanwhile, under that banner of order, she had treated the reserve account like private maneuvering capital. That's the part people in the neighborhood had the hardest time absorbing. Not just that she had gone after the train, not just that she had tried to use the HOA as a weapon, but that while lecturing everyone about standards, she had quietly allowed money to move toward her own family's orbit. There was a second layer, too. The legal invoices tied to the crossing fight turned out to be more extensive than the board had openly discussed. Preliminary consultations, drafting work, county outreach, correspondence, research. Added all together, and the neighborhood had spent thousands before residents even understood what was happening. Those expenditures became harder for her to defend after the county issued its written position. And the county did issue one. A formal advisory letter, not dramatic in tone, but devastating in effect. It confirmed that the crossing and corridor remained protected under recorded land instruments, that any attempt by a successor residential entity to interfere with or petition against those established freight rights could expose the association to legal and financial consequences, and that county agencies would not support efforts to restrict lawful rail operations solely based on neighborhood preference. That ended the rail argument in any serious sense. Vanessa could still complain, she could still posture, she could still tell a handful of loyalists that residents were being bullied by old infrastructure and technicalities, but the actual path she had spent months trying to build had collapsed. The county wasn't taking it. The board no longer had the votes. The money trail was under court scrutiny, and the crossing itself had now become a symbol of her overreach instead of her leadership. She resigned 8 days later, not with a speech, not with an apology, not at a meeting full of residents. She sent an email, short, bloodless, and written in that same polished style she'd always used when trying to sound bigger than the room. It said she was stepping down in the interest of reducing division, and that recent distortions had made her continued service untenable. No mention of Blue Summit. No mention of the reserve account. No mention of the Carters, the Alvarez family, the years of selective enforcement, or the train campaign that had burned through community trust and legal expense for no legitimate reason. Just a departure memo from a person still trying to control the final paragraph. The neighborhood did not let that be the final paragraph. At the emergency board meeting that followed, Craig resigned too. Not because the lawsuit accused him of leading anything, but because he admitted he had not pushed hard enough when reserve transfers started looking irregular. Laura stayed. Denise stayed. A retired CPA named Judith Warren joined as interim treasurer, and within 2 meetings she had ordered an independent financial review. That review widened the lens even further. Not every problem traced back to malice. Some was sloppiness, some was deference, some was the ordinary danger of small boards where one assertive person controls the agenda and everyone else gradually starts accepting whatever is put in front of them. But all of that still has consequences. In HOA life, passivity can cost just as much as scheming. The final settlement took months. Insurance covered part of it. Vanessa, through counsel, agreed to a structured repayment component tied to the Blue Summit transfers. Melanie Pike's company dissolved before the case reached its ugliest stage. The board, under pressure from both the insurer and the court timetable, adopted sweeping governance reforms as part of the internal cleanup. Conflict of interest disclosures became mandatory. Vendor relationships had to be documented in writing. Reserve expenditures above a low threshold required expanded review. Meeting minutes had to identify recusals by name. Financial summaries could no longer be distributed in stripped-down form without backup availability for homeowners upon request. That may sound dry, but dry rules are what keep petty empires from forming. The reserve money that could be recovered was recovered, not all at once, but enough to stabilize the account and avoid a broader assessment on homeowners. The legal challenge to the railroad died permanently. The crossing remained what it had always been, a legal, active piece of infrastructure doing exactly what it was built to do. And then something happened I honestly didn't expect. The neighborhood got quieter. Not because the train stopped. It didn't. Not because everyone suddenly became friends. They didn't. But because the ambient tension lifted. People who had spent years trying not to attract the board's attention started acting like residents instead of defendants. Kids' bikes lingered longer near driveways. A portable hoop went back up on Juniper Court, and for the first time in a long time, nobody rushed to measure anything. Conversations at the mailbox got easier. Group texts became less paranoid and more practical. The Carters received a written notice formally dismissing several old violation balances that should never have been issued in the first place. The Alvarez family got reimbursement for attorney consultation they'd once paid out of pocket, trying to contest a plainly selective enforcement action. Those things mattered. So did the smaller gestures. A neighborhood potluck in the common area. A volunteer day for trail cleanup. People showing up to board meetings not because they loved procedure, but because they had finally learned what happens when nobody watches. As for me, I kept running the line. The first Tuesday after Vanessa resigned, I approached the crossing at the usual speed, sounded the horn, and watched the lights flash over County Route 18 exactly as they had 100 times before. No crowd, no signs, no woman in a camel coat trying to turn public infrastructure into a stage. Just the road, the arms, the morning, and a couple of commuters waiting the 40 seconds it takes for a freight run to pass. I won't pretend that felt heroic. It felt right. That's different. There's a temptation after a fight like that to turn it into a story about one dramatic morning and one perfect takedown, but that's not what fixed Briar Glen. What fixed it was slower and less cinematic. Records kept when nobody cared. Bylaws read when everyone else skimmed. Neighbors who finally compared notes. one board member